Okay. Hello. Um, um, so announcements, number one, I guess I should have sent an email about this, but I hope it was clear. So ME number 5 is now due Thursday, but if you did it early, that's fine. And the ME number 6 will be due a week from today. And what else? Um, Yeah, so as far as I know, the strike is going to happen on Thursday, as planned. So as I said before, I'm just gonna go to Zoom only. Um, and also, as I said in my email, if I don't know if there's people who like feel like they're crossing that picket line by watching a Zoom lecture or whatever. I mean, like I understand that if that's the case. Um, If you even have a problem with watching the recorded lecture, I guess you should get in touch with me and I'll send you my notes or something. Uh, as usual, attendance is not required, so that's that. Um, all right, so I'm going to pick up with something I wanted to talk about last time and I didn't really get to talk about, which is um, Berkeley's actual argument against the existence of matter. Uh, oh, wait. So, after I finish talking about that, I'm going to talk about some things that come up in today's reading, namely the refutation of skepticism, infinite divisibility of space, and um, I don't know, what I guess I could call Berkeley's philosophy of science. Um, so, but first, so I mean, it's important to understand what this is an argument against and what it isn't. Um, it's not an argument that there's no external source of my ideas, right? Because Berkeley thinks there is an external source of many of my ideas, namely God. Um, apparently, although sometimes he talks as if other finite spirits might also be responsible for some of my ideas, apparently that's always indirect. It's very much like the way Leibniz explains the interaction of finite beings with each other, right? Like the other finite spirit makes certain motions, which means that it causes certain ideas. Somehow it's able to cause certain sensible ideas of its own body, right? But then it has to rely on God to cause corresponding ideas in my mind, right? So like it can make its mouth move and do various things, but it can't directly create a sound in my mind. God has to do that. Um, uh, I mean, perhaps it doesn't even move its own body directly. I don't recall a place where he clearly says one way or the other about that. It probably would have been addressed in part two. All right. Anyway, so right, so like it's not that there's no external source of my ideas, but it's well, first of all, and it's that the external source of ideas is not matter. And what does matter mean? Well, I mean, it means something that has the primary qualities. Extension, figure, bulk, motion, whatever, right? That's matter. Um, that's the standard early modern definition of matter. And, it's it's somewhat related to the history of the term matter before the early modern period, but it's complicated. But anyway, that's what he means by matter. And so the question of the existence of matter is really a question of whether something in the external source of my ideas resembles the primary, what Locke would call ideas of primary qualities. Right? Because like if God did resemble my ideas of primary qualities, then God would be matter. And we wouldn't have an argument against the existence of matter. So it really all comes down to that. And remember what I claimed that Locke thinks about this, which is, remember, he says that there's a visible necessary connection between our ideas of primary quality and only our ideas of primary qualities. And I even claimed, although this is, I mean, I'm saying things on Locke's behalf that Locke doesn't explicitly say, right? But I'm trying to put things together in a way that makes some sense. And I even claim that that's why they're primary qualities. And namely, because since there's a visible necessary connection between these two ideas, let's say the idea of solidity and idea of resistance, or whatever. And as usual, the mind can't make its own simple ideas. I should have mentioned, by the way, that Berkeley apparently agrees with that, although he doesn't emphasize it. Right? That is, only God can make new simple ideas in me. So the mind can't make its own simple ideas. So these ideas must have come into my mind from powers in an external substance to cause them. And then the question of whether these powers resemble the ideas, I claimed, is the question of whether there's a analogous structure in the ideas and in the qualities. And if we can see somehow that this idea makes this one necessary, even though they have nothing in common. I mean, they're simple ideas. I don't know if resistance is really a simple idea, but let's say they're simple ideas, right? So they can't have anything in common if they're distinct, simple ideas. So, but nevertheless, we can see that one of them requires the other. See, right? That's Locke's metaphor, visible necessary connection. And if one of these requires the other, then one of these qualities must require the other. And so we know something about an analogous structure in the external substance, a structure analogous to the structure of our ideas, right? And my claim is that that very abstract thing is what Locke must really mean when he says these qualities really are in the external body and they resemble my ideas and everything like that. So, so I think the core of Berkeley's argument actually is that, I mean, this part, I think he thinks so obvious that he doesn't even say it, but it's the key thing. He thinks that it's absurd for something to necessitate something else unless it has the power to cause it. So, I mean, Locke does not claim that ideas have the power to cause other ideas. He doesn't claim it, and I think he would deny it just as strongly as Berkeley does. Right? Remember, like, for example, in the discussion of the will, where Locke makes it clear that a quality has to inhere in a substance. That is a power. That is, what has the power is the substance. That is, causes are substances. Things like ideas that can't subsist on their own are not causes. And why exactly does, I mean, on the one hand, I can say, and that's perfectly traditional, right? I mean, and it's agreed on not just by Locke and Berkeley, but by lots of other people, right? Leibniz famously says the mark of substance is to act. Like exactly what the connection between that and being the substrate. I think I could probably explain it, but I'm not going to try to. So anyway, like, so just take that for granted that Locke and Berkeley agree that these things are causally inert. But Locke thinks, nevertheless, there's this weird kind of inert necessitation, right? Like that's what visibly necessary means. It's like, um, um, it's necessary just because perceiving it involves perceiving that the other one is necessarily there, but not because not because we understand how this one causes that one, not because we can explain this one using that one. So, so Berkeley thinks that's absurd. And, you know, when you think about it, he has a leg to stand on there, right? What do you mean this one necessitates this one, but doesn't explain why it's there, doesn't cause it, doesn't have any power? What are you even saying when you say it makes it necessary? So therefore, this kind of visible necessary connection is impossible, according to Berkeley. Now, I mean, it's Hume who's famous for asserting this. There's never a necessary connection between distinct ideas, right? But Berkeley has already used it. So if there's no necessary connection between distinct ideas, then this kind of resemblance is impossible. And so these powers that we can infer are found in the external object are bare powers in Locke's terminology. That is, like crudely put, there are no things in the external object corresponding to these two powers. Or more less crudely put, there is no, we don't know of any structure in the external object which somehow relates these powers or distinguishes them from each other as distinct terms. So, and this holds generally for anything that is an idea, or in fact, anything that's merely the affection of a substance, rather than its power or operation, right? So this is what Berkeley says. This is section 25 of part 1 on page 33. A little attention will discover to us that the very being of an idea implies passiveness and inertness in it, insomuch that it is impossible for an idea to do anything, or strictly speaking, to be the cause of anything. Oh, was that what I wanted to read? Neither can it be the resemblance or pattern of any active being, as is evident from section 8. It's not. Hmm. I know this quote is somewhere, but it's not where I wrote in my notes that it is. It is impossible for an idea to do anything or. Oh, no. Okay. That is what I just read. Oh, right. Neither can it be the resemblance or pattern of any active being, right? That is, no causally inert things can resemble something that's active. Um, so therefore, how can I represent a substance? Not through my ideas, because my ideas don't resemble a substance. What in me does resemble a substance? Well, me. Right? I'm a substance. So the way I said this last time, the way I represent a spirit is by being a spirit. Um, and that's the only way for me to represent a substance. Therefore, the causes of all my ideas, that is, the subjects of the powers by which I'm affected, are all spirits. Right? That is because they're all substances that I represent by being the kind of substance I am. That is, they're spirits. um, and all their qualities are secondary qualities. That is, all their powers are bare powers. Um, and we can't, again, we can't separate, we can't uh, you can't distinguish some structure in them corresponding to the difference between the different powers that result in different ideas. Okay, so this is lower down on the same page, page 33, but section 27. Um, if any man shall doubt the truth of what is here delivered, let him but reflect and try if he can frame the idea of any power or active being, and whether he has ideas of two principal powers marked by the names will and understanding, distinct from each other, as well from a third idea of substance or being in general, with a relative notion of its supporting or being the subject of the aforesaid powers. Right? That's what Berkeley is saying we can't do. Of course, we know spirits have many powers, but we can't use ideas to represent them as having many powers because our ideas don't resemble anything in them. Um, so, I mean, Berkeley said a lot of other things against the existence of matter, mostly answering objections where the person says something like, well, can't I still believe in matter, but just think that it's not a body and I don't know what it is? And stuff like that. And, uh, the answer to all of those, I think, is either you're thinking of nothing or you're thinking of a spirit, right? Like if I say I'm thinking of matter, but it's not a body, then you could say, well, you're right. There is an external source of your ideas, and it's not a body, but that's not what we call matter. That's spirit. right? Or you can say, I'm thinking of something that's not a body and it's not spirit and it's not extended and it's not in time and it's not, and then Berkeley will say, what you're saying is, as far as I can tell, identical to my idea of nothing, right? It consists entirely of negative predicates. Um, or sometimes Berkeley will say, uh, where someone says, well, perhaps there's some unknown type of substance that has no interaction with me at all, and I don't know anything about. And Berkeley will say, well, I mean, first of all, what's the point of speculating about that? Who cares if there's some substance that has no interaction with us at all, we don't know anything about? But second of all, I think, I mean, this has to be adjusted somewhat for the fact that we're talking about spirits and we're not representing them with ideas at all. But I feel like somehow Berkeley is going to come in there and say, and moreover, we can't perform the necessary abstraction, right? That is, you want to say, you want to say, well, I want to keep the idea of substance, but get rid of everything else about it and just keep that distinct. But Berkeley will say that we can't do that. Okay, so that in a nutshell, I think is Berkeley's argument against the existence of matter. And it's, I mean, um, as an argument against Locke, at least it's pretty good. Um, so uh, if we don't like the conclusion, we might have to really think again about what's going on here. Which, does Hume do that? Not really, sort of. It depends how you look at it. But, I mean, as I said, I think at the beginning of the class, one of the things that Kant is responding to in his predecessors is that both the rationalist and the empiricist line ended up with a conclusion that their corporeal substance is impossible. And um, uh, something must have gone wrong. Um, okay. So are there questions about that before I go on to talk about this week's reading or today's reading? Yeah.
What do you make of the section that added at the end of 27, where he says that we do have a spirit who like
Yeah, I read that last time. Insofar as in as much as we know or understand the meaning of those words, right? And I said that, like, at first that sounds like it doesn't make any sense. But when you put it together with what he says about the proper function of language, I think it does make sense, right? That is, he's saying that the use of those words is to express my will and to influence your will, and therefore they're perfectly meaningful. But not by means of ideas. So, right, and then I gave the example of, like the use of the idea of gold when I say, give me the gold, right? So the idea of gold has an instrumental use there, right? Like I would like you to have the idea of gold because that will make it more likely for you to give me the gold, right? But if it can work without that, that's fine too, right? So that like it's not the case that a word is being used without meaning when it doesn't stimulate an idea. Um, uh, and it's not necessarily the case that a word is meaningless if it never signifies any idea. Um, I mean, I don't want to say that, and therefore there's nothing weird about this. It's really weird.
Is it not an issue self-reflexive that it can recognize itself?
Can it recognize itself? I mean, yeah, but I mean, it has it by, so, okay, I mean, there is one thing that confuses me, which is that every once in a while Berkeley talks about ideas of reflection. I, I think, I, I don't think he ever gives examples. But he can't mean what I think Locke means by ideas of reflection, namely ideas that are um, caused by the operations of my mind. Um, because, well, maybe he does mean that ideas that are caused by my own mind. So he would count like what we would usually call imagination as ideas of reflection. I mean, that would be really different from what Locke means by it, though. So I doubt it, right? So like Locke's example of an idea of reflection would be like sensation. Sensation is an operation of a spirit, and according to Berkeley, there is no idea corresponding to it. So yeah, but I mean, so I'm not sure what he means by that, but I think that what he mostly means when he said, if you're to ask, well, so do I know what a spirit is? So like knowing what something is means representing it accurately. And I do that by being it.
Is it similar, or in what ways is it similar to Descartes, like Vita? Like, how can we understand it as like a part of the empiricist tradition if it sounds kind of so similar to that?
I don't, I mean, so I'm planning to talk about the sense in which Berkeley is an empiricist, but but and well, I mean, you can already see in what sense he's an even stricter empiricist than Locke, right? Because Locke's empiricism means that uh, my simple ideas come from experience. But it's not true that all my knowledge is based on experience, according to Locke, right? Because once I have these ideas, I don't need any experience to know that they're connected in a certain way, right? That's what Kant would call synthetic a priori judgments. But although, I mean, since Kant agrees that the visible necessary connection is nonsense, he's going to have to give a whole different explanation of how synthetic a priori judgment is possible. But that's the topic of the critique of pure reason. How is synthetic a priori judgment possible? Right. So, but Berkeley is saying, no, all our knowledge comes from experience. The only way we know that ideas agree or disagree with each other is because they come together. um, so, but as for the knowledge of myself, I mean, I don't, I mean, I don't think that I don't see that that's more rationalist than empiricist. I mean, like to know something by being it, is that knowing it by reason or knowing it by experience? It's not really. So, yeah, I mean, how it relates to the cogito argument, I don't know. I don't want to try to figure that out standing on my foot here. It's a good question, but um, and how it relates to Locke's version of the cogito. Um, okay. Are there other questions? All right, so I'm going to talk about the refutation of skepticism. In the past, I've put this off to the end and not gotten to it, which I think is a shame, but it means I'll put something else off to the end and not get to that. But anyway, here we go. So there's a little history of skepticism given in sections 86 through 88 of part 1. Um, so it starts with So long as men thought that real things subsisted without the mind, and that their knowledge was only so far forth real as it was conformable to real things, it follows that they could not be certain that they had any real knowledge at all. For how can it be known that the things which are perceived are conformable to those which are not perceived or can exist without the mind or exist without the mind? Now, again, right, I mean, how can it be known according to Locke? Because there's visible necessary connections. That's how it can be known. Um, but if that's absurd, yeah, how can it be known? So this leads to skepticism. Actually, another problem for a problem for my reading of Locke is that Locke doesn't seem to give as strong a refutation of skepticism as I think he should. I think he should be able to. So that's also a question, but I'm not going to go into that now. All right. Anyway, um, um, I mean, I guess I say this is a history of skepticism, but it really just stops there. I mean, um, right? It's so the issue is, as he said, it explains in more detail in section 87 that color, figure, motion, and extension and the like, considered as only so many sensations in the mind, are perfectly known, there being nothing in them which is not perceived, right? So he's saying you can't be skeptical about that. A good question is how this is related to Descartes' argument. I, a lot of people think this is Descartes' argument, but I think it's not. But it is Berkeley's argument, right? He's saying, look, you so to speak see them directly, so how can you doubt their existence? End of story. But if they are looked at as notes or images referred to things or archetypes existing without the mind, then we are involved all in skepticism, right? So that word archetype here, um, I take it as comes from Locke. I mean, not that Locke is the only person to ever use the word archetype, but I think that's clearly where it's coming from here in context. Um, so um, so this history of skepticism, first of all, is a big influence, I think, on common ideas about so-called modern skepticism. Right? I guess I should erase this. Oops, what happened to that? I'm sorry, I'm having trouble with my hip. I'm kind of like stumbling around here. Is there a eraser? This quarter was my knee, and now somehow it doesn't make sense. Anyway, there you go. So, right, so now I'm talking about refutation of skepticism. So, right, a lot of people make a distinction between ancient skepticism and modern skepticism. Yeah, I mean, there is definitely a distinction between the role that skepticism played in ancient philosophy and the role it played in early modern philosophy. Because in ancient philosophy, the skeptics were a sect or school of philosophers who thought skepticism was great. So they weren't trying to refute skepticism. They were trying to prove or whatever you do with skepticism. They were trying to get you to adopt skepticism. Um, uh, and to do that, they offered like for any possible thesis, they proposed to offer an argument in favor of it and an argument against it. And both of which were supposed to be good arguments, and therefore that would impel you to suspend judgment. Um, So whereas in early modern philosophy, everyone is trying to make sure that they're not a skeptic, at least as they use the term skeptic. Like my teacher, Stanley Cavell, defines skeptic in such a way that all of these people count as skeptics, but I'm not going to try to explain why. The way they use the term skeptic, they want to say, I'm not a skeptic. Um, so that's definitely a difference. But the question is there a difference in the content of skepticism? And like what Berkeley says here is definitely different from ancient skepticism, right? Because what he says is you can be sure about the existence of your own ideas. There's no doubts about that. That is, this is his presentation of skepticism, which he's going to refute, right? But his presentation of skepticism, his skeptic says, oh, yeah, I'm sure that my own ideas exist, but I'm not sure if external things exist corresponding to them. I'm not sure if their archetypes exist, right? So, whereas the ancient skeptics, like, didn't have some things that they said, oh, we're sure about this. Their aim was to suspend judgment about everything, right? And these are stories um, about Pyrrhus. His students had to follow him around and stop him from like walking off cliffs and stuff, because he he wouldn't acknowledge that he was sure there was a cliff there, even for the purposes of action. Right? Apparently, his students were not as good skeptics as he was. um, so anyway, uh, not Pyrrhus, Pyrrhon. All right. Anyway, uh, and that is a difference that a lot of the people often identify between ancient skepticism and modern skepticism. People will say ancient skepticism was about doubting everything. Modern skepticism is really about doubting the existence of the external world. So I'm saying that's true of what Berkeley here is calling skepticism. Um, it might be true of the kind of skepticism Locke is trying to refute. It's hard to say. He doesn't have like a section headed refutation of skepticism. It's like he definitely at some point argues against people who don't believe in the existence of the external world. But I don't know if we can say that's his refutation of skepticism. This certainly doesn't apply to Descartes, right? The distinction between ideas and things doesn't even appear in the Meditations until after the cogito argument. It's not part of the doubt at all. Right? The whole first meditation, which is what establishes um, the um, the meditator's ability to call all their own old beliefs into question, proceeds without making a distinction between ideas and things. Um, Therefore, Descartes' motives for doubt in the first meditation are not the ones that Berkeley is assigning to him. And like, I'm making this point not just to make a point about Descartes, because I'm going to turn around and ask in what sense Berkeley has actually refuted skepticism, even about the external world. Because, what are Descartes' motives for doubting the existence of the external world? Um, well, I mean, he follows, as he even says explicitly in the discourse, um, he follows the method of the ancient skeptics. That is, he finds contradictions in our ordinary beliefs. I mean, it's more or less that method of the ancient skeptics. He doesn't produce a proof on each side. I don't think they always do either. Sometimes they just, uh, you know, stick our beliefs against each other, right? So he finds contradictions in our ordinary beliefs. For example, um, like, I believe that the senses are, you know, faithfully reveal to me what is out there. But I also believe that sometimes from far away, I see a tower that looks round from far away, but then when I get closer, I realize it's actually square. I guess by square it means it's shapen, right? Um, it can't be both round and square. So my ordinary belief that things are the way they look to me can't be right because it implies a contradiction. It implies both that it's round and that it's square. Right, and this is, as I point out probably ad nauseum in 100B, like this is the method you have to do if you want to establish general skepticism, right? I mean, you have to use our beliefs against each other because you can't appeal to some external standard that's supposed to be certain. Then that will be exempt from your skepticism, right? So instead you say, well, I don't know which one is false, but at least one of them is false. And so you have a reason to doubt all of them. I mean, then of course the meditator goes on to discuss the question, well, aren't there some cases that are so clear that I can't doubt them and whatever? But this is the basic, I mean, this example is actually in the sixth meditation, but this is the basic strategy. So, so what's Berkeley's resolution of this? In effect, it's that there are really two towers here. There's a round tower and there's a square tower. The round tower is what I would usually call my idea of a round tower. And the square tower is what I would usually call my idea of a square tower. And what's the relationship between them? Well, the square tower, among other things, given my previous experience of the divine will, the round tower serves as a sign that if I do certain things, the square tower is coming. So there's no contradiction. Right, this is syntactic regularity among my ideas of sense. It's part of the grammar of the language that I've gathered God is using to talk to me. And that's useful, again, because I can conform my will to God's will as best I can. And, you know, by making my own ideas follow similar rules, or at least rules that, according to my experience, come out with the right conclusion, right? And then I can know things like when I see the round tower, I can know, oh, I might see this square tower if I got real close, right? By imagining it. Or maybe not even by imagining it, maybe by translating this directly to a word and doing some stuff with symbols in language and then translating it back to an image at the end. Yeah.
We talked before about how imagination is like the anticipation, the senses that God kind of has in control, right? But if you don't know that it's going to be a square tower, and all you're left with is this feeling that it's a, circular tower, then do you have a way to like decide which direction you want your imagination to be going in? Or is it just like defined retroactively once you find out that it's a square tower?
Well, I mean, so obviously, like, we don't know what's going to happen, generally speaking. um, this is something for people who are in my 125 course in the fall. This is something Popper, right? Like if the solution to the problem of induction is supposed to say how we can know what's going to happen in the future, the answer is we can't. It's the future. It hasn't happened yet, right? Yeah, so, no, I mean, when I see the round tower, if I've experienced in the past the things that look round from far away, sometimes, does this actually happen? I guess it must. I think, by the way, this isn't Descartes' original example. It may actually go back to the ancient skeptics, or maybe even be older than that. I don't know exactly where it comes from. But in any case, assume this really happens. So like my experience is sometimes I see these things that look round from far away, but then when I get closer, it looks square. So I see something round and it's true. I can't conclude from that that it's going to be square when I get closer to it, but I can prepare for the possibility, you know. So like when I say tracking the divine will, of course, I don't mean tracking it with absolute certainty. That's never going to happen. Um, but because the divine will, in fact, is very regular and trustworthy, oftentimes this works as far as I'm able to take it, right? So I'm not able to take it in this case, maybe so far as to know whether it's going to look round or square when I get close up. But, you know, I don't expect it to look like this when I get close up. You know, so I do know something, or at least I expect something, and my expectations are often correct. Um, it's actually not that different from Popper's view in some ways, but I'm not going to go more into Popper. All right. But note the consequences, though, I mean, I basically already said this, but now I'm going to read it. Section 65 on page, section 107 on page 65. By a diligent observation of the phenomena within our view, we may discover the general laws of nature and from them deduce the other phenomena. I do not say demonstrate, for all deductions of that kind depend on a supposition that the author of nature always operates uniformly and in a constant observance of those rules we take for principles, which we cannot evidently know. Does that mean which we evidently cannot know? I think it means what we cannot evidently know, but I'm not sure. Anyway, um, uh, so, um, yeah, I don't know for sure that what's going to happen when I quote unquote get closer to the tower. And remember, getting closer to the tower means like somehow using my will, I'm able to like change some sensible ideas of my own body. Again, I suspect actually Berkeley thinks it's not direct. That what I do is imagine my body moving in a certain way, and apply my will to it, and God causes the actual ideas of sense. But you know, however exactly that works, I can quote unquote move. I mean, except quote unquote, this is what Berkeley thinks we always really mean when we say I can move, right? So I can move closer, and I expect the tower to change in certain ways. That is, or for there to be a series of towers that are different from each other in certain ways. But that all just totally rests in my trust that the divine will continue according to the principles I've gathered it's working under. Now, I mean, I think obviously the divine will continue in the principles that it's actually working under. Again, I don't know if Berkeley would agree that God doesn't change or not. He doesn't address that here, and I'm not sure exactly what it would mean because he thinks that change is an idea, but I'm not sure. Anyway, but that's why he says it's a supposition that the author of nature always operates uniformly and in a constant observance of those rules we take for principles. But we might be wrong. Those might not be the principles. So, um, so what does that mean? Well, it means like, I can't doubt the existence of this round tower when I'm seeing a round tower. And I can't doubt the existence of this square tower when I'm seeing a square tower. But if by the tower you mean the whole regularity of how it appears as I interact with it in different ways, then um, the only assurance I have of that is the goodness of the divine will. Otherwise, it could be a round tower this minute, and next minute it could be a banana, right? Like that's not harder for God to do than to cause the series of towers I'm expecting. But a round tower that looks like a banana when you get closer to it is not a tower, right? There's no tower there. Or something that looks like a tower, but when you reach your hand out, it goes through it instead of being stopped. That's not a tower. That's like an illusion of a tower, a hologram of a tower, or something like that. It's missing some of the ideas that we put together to form our idea of the substance that is the tower. That is in the sense of idea of substance that Berkeley will admit. Right? Berkeley says in ordinary language, when we talk about ideas of substances, do we really? But I don't know. Anyway, what we mean is just that collection of ideas that we often find together as we expect to find together in the future, right? So that collection of ideas isn't limited to, it looks round from this one point of view, this one time, right? It includes all the other things that something has to do to count as a real tower. Similarly, like I can't doubt that the existence of a visible apple when I'm seeing it, or of the tangible apple when I'm feeling it, or of the whatever you say there for smell, apple when I'm smelling it, right? But if I want to know that there's an apple there, it means I want to know that's something that looks like an apple and feels like an apple and smells like an apple, et cetera, right? And again, my only guarantee of that is the goodness of the divine will. So basically, like, um, Berkeley's real refutation of skepticism is the same as Descartes'. It just comes down to the regularity of the divine will. I'm not sure if he realizes that. And he either doesn't realize that and is so carried away with the fact that, yeah, there's something there that I can't doubt. And it's not different from the tower. It's not an image of the tower, right? But he doesn't notice like what has to be the case if I'm justified in saying there's a tower there. Forgetting about the existence of external objects completely. There's still something really complicated has to be true. So like, again, either he doesn't notice that or he does notice it, but he does not want to emphasize it because he wants to emphasize how this theory can refute skepticism. I'm not sure which. Okay, are there questions about that? Or I not understand Berkeley correctly. That's also possible, obviously. I could say that after every single thing I say, so. All right. So if there's no questions about that, I'm going to talk next about the infinite divisibility of space. I mean, this is kind of a specialized thing. It's not a core part of Berkeley's philosophy, but I do want to be able to compare what he says to what Hume says about this. Because I think historically, this question is really important, both before and after these people. So like this, okay, so the next topic is infinite divisibility of space. Or lack thereof, according to Berkeley. But Um, so, I mean, first of all, this is an issue between Berkeley and mathematicians. Um, it's related to things Berkeley said in other places. He just kind of hints at it here, but he's very critical of the calculus and right, like anything that involves infinitesimals. Um, um, However, I mean, I think the issue here can be understood without going into the question of what like the notation of infinitesimals means in the calculus. So, and Berkeley's main claim against mathematics is that it contains valid conclusions from false premises, right? So that Berkeley doesn't think the mathematicians have made any mistakes in their proofs. Um, but he thinks they've admitted false first principles into their science. And therefore, all the proofs are um, valid but not sound, as we said, right? So there's no reason to expect their conclusion to be true. So, and in fact, the conclusion in many cases is not true. Now, I mean, obviously, but I'm going to put off talking about this. There's going to be a question. Well, if the conclusions of mathematics are not true, why is it so useful? Berkeley does have something to say about that. But first, like, why are the conclusions of mathematics not true? So his explanation, this is section 118 on page 70. Mathematicians, though they deduce their theorems from a great height of evidence, yet their first principles are limited by the consideration of quantity, and they do not ascend into any inquiry concerning those transcendental maxims which influence all the particular sciences, each part whereof, mathematics not accepted, does consequently participate of the errors involved in them. Um, so it's interesting that this is a one, at least possible correct use of the term transcendental. I don't, I called some of Locke's ideas transcendental ideas, but Locke didn't use that term. I take it Berkeley is getting this from at least indirect acquaintance with scholasticism. So I guess this is evidence that he knows something about what the schoolmen say. Anyway, that's not really very relevant here. His main point is that mathematicians like start from axioms that seem evidently true to them, but these axioms are actually based on earlier first principles that they haven't questioned. And that if they had questioned, they would realize that the axioms themselves are not exactly true. And since they're not exactly true, everything you prove from them is not exactly true, even if you do the proof exactly correctly. Um, and what are the false principles? Well, it should come as no surprise that to learn that the false principles are abstract ideas and the existence of external objects, right? It's the same false principles, as Berkeley says here, that infect all the sciences. They've also done their mischief in mathematics. Um, so, so how does this actually work? I mean, let me take an example of proof that extension is infinitely divisible. So Berkeley actually says at one point that this principle is not expressly laid down as an axiom or a theorem in their systems, but they all assume it's true. But I think it is a theorem. Right? So, I mean, first of all, it's a theorem in Euclid that every line can be divided into two. I guess that already shows that extension is infinitely divisible, but it's worse than that, right? So, maybe I should draw this smaller so I can draw the big square. This is supposed to be small. Believe me, it's a square. All right. So the little square, let's say the little square has side 1. What's the length of this line here, the side of the bigger square? I mean, I hope you've seen this proof before. This proof is actually the proof that Socrates makes the slave go through or helps the slave go through, or prompts the slave. I don't know. Anyway, this is the proof that Socrates and the slave go through in the Neon. Right? So if this is a size 1, well, I mean, the area of this square is 1, obviously. And the area of each one of these halves is 1/2. And there's 4 of them in this square, so the area of this square is 2. So whatever the length of this side here is, we know that its square is 2. And now the question is, can you divide this side into some natural number of pieces, right? We say divide this side into m pieces, such that this side is exactly m pieces long, right? So that would mean that n squared over m squared equals 2. And it's pretty easy to show that this can't be true for any 2 natural numbers. That is, as we usually say, that the square root of 2 is irrational, right? It's basically all you have to do is like prime factorize both n and m and count up how many 2's there are on each side. And then there's going to be an even number of 2's on this side. And when you move the m squared here, there's going to be an odd number of 2's on this side. So they can't equal each other, right? I mean, you also have to prove that every natural number has a unique prime factorization. But, okay, so like this is a pretty simple mathematical proof that shows that there's no minimum unit of space, right? Because if there were, then each of these sides would have to be some definite number of those minimum units. Now, I mean, of course, this proof uses a bunch of other axioms, like the axiom that you can draw a line segment connecting a unique line segment connecting any 2 points, and so forth. So where does Berkeley think this proof goes wrong? And what does it have to do with the existence of external objects and or abstract ideas? So, first of all, like, what does Berkeley think? So Berkeley thinks there's some truth to this. The truth to it is, and this is the only way we ever actually use it. The truth to it is that the more finely you're able to divide the lines, the closer this will come to being true. Right? So, like, if you're only able to measure how long they are approximately in inches, and this one is 1 inch long, then this one is to that accuracy is also going to be 1 inch long. So this is very far from being true, right? But then if you go to tenths of an inch, this one is like 1.4 inches long. And this one is 1.0 inches long, and this will be closer to being true. And the more finely you divide the lines, the closer it is to being true. And Berkeley says, the more finely you can divide the lines, that is, the bigger the lines are. So um, um, there is a minimum size that anything can be in space, which is the size of a simple idea that I can't break up. And every line I actually see or imagine contains some exact number of those minimum points, but the bigger ones contain more of those points, and the smaller ones contain fewer of those points. Now, this is a little misleading, I think, or confusing. I already pointed out the same issue in Locke in a different context. I mean, in this sense of big, how big something is, it's related to what I was saying about the tower, right? Like how big the idea is, that can't be measured in inches because, take a ruler that's measured off in inches and move it back and forth, and the idea of an inch gets bigger and smaller, right? So the idea of an inch isn't some definite size idea, whereas Berkeley talks as if it were, right? He says there is no such thing as the 10,000th part of an inch, meaning that, this minimum size is more than 1/10,000th of an inch. But really, like how many of these there are in an inch depends on where the inch is. But that doesn't really change what he's saying here. I mean, I think that maybe just makes it clearer what he's saying here. You can say, like, the more acutely, the more closely you view the lines, that is, in Berkeley's terminology, like whatever you do to make the line with only a few simple ideas in it be replaced by one with more. Like what we usually call getting closer to it, or looking at it through a microscope or whatever, right? Like all those things generate new ideas that have more parts. At least, I mean, of course, it's also, there's another complication that Berkeley doesn't consider, which is that once the idea has enough parts, you can't see it all at the same time. That is, it isn't really just one idea anymore, and it gets more complicated, right? He talks about how the radius of the Earth has more than 10,000 parts, but if we actually were far enough away to see the entire radius of the Earth, that wouldn't be true, according to him. When we're close enough that we see more than 10,000 parts, we don't see them all at the same time. And so there's something else in about rules about moving back and forth, and it's really complicated, right? But the basic idea is, again, like basic doctrine. I don't want to use the word idea. The basic doctrine here is that what mathematicians have really been able to prove is that the more parts the two lines have, the closer this is to being true. Now, as I said, like the mathematicians got to this by using certain axioms, and they somehow got this approximately right answer, which again, by the way, I just want to emphasize, like, we never actually can measure an irrational number of units or irrational length, right? Like every measurement is a rational number. So this is the way we actually use the theorem, which therefore Berkeley in a sense is right when he says all the uses of mathematics won't be changed at all by my principles. But so how did they manage to get this approximately true principle, starting with their axioms? I think Berkeley thinks the axioms are empirical. Right? I mean, Locke thinks that axioms are a matter of necessary connection between distinct ideas. I think Berkeley thinks the axioms are empirical. That is, again, like we've found that due to the regularity of the divine will, you know, you can do things that will lead to this small triangle being replaced by this big triangle. These are two different ideas. And like, it so happens that, again, due to the regularity of the divine will, if you do certain measurements on this small one and you do similar measurements on this big one, this one will be closer. They'll both be relatively close to making this right, and this one will be closer. We found that by experience of triangles. And that's the only part of it. That's as much of this as Berkeley thinks makes sense. Now, so why do the mathematicians think they've shown more than that? Right? That is why the mathematicians think they've shown that this line has infinitely many parts. And that if you count all infinitely many parts, you can make this true. And then when you say, but wait, that doesn't make sense. 1 infinity squared is 2 times another infinity squared. They'll say, according to Berkeley, well, you shouldn't expect, the human mind's not made for thinking about infinity. So of course it gets into paradoxes when it tries to think about them. Berkeley says, that's ridiculous. The human mind not made for thinking about it. You shouldn't be thinking about it at all, right? Like, say what you're really thinking and let's see if it makes sense. So, but what led them to that? What to Berkeley? And I mean, it takes a while to get yourself into this mindset because, as Berkeley says, well, I mean, I don't think this is all there is to it, actually. But part of the reason is that, as Berkeley says, we're so used to this. At least if we've studied geometry, let alone set theory or something like that, we're so used to this that it takes a while to figure out why anyone would think there's anything strange about this. But Berkeley says, look, this is an absurd paradox. This has infinitely many parts, yet it's finitely long, and it's such and such longer than this one. And what are you talking about? And he says, this is like, and of course he appeals to transubstantiation, right? He says, this is just like the way a convert to Catholicism can gradually be brought to accept the doctrine of transubstantiation. Similarly, if since you're little, it's beat into you to believe what the mathematicians say, eventually you believe this ridiculous thing. All right. So, but like, what led them to believe it in the first place? And the answer is, well, so they thought that although their idea is only finitely complicated, they thought basically two things. That is, it uses both of the principles here. So they thought, number one, that as far as how many pieces there are in it, we abstract from that. And we just consider the shape. And then they thought that even though in the case of ideas, all those shapes have finitely many parts on each side, in the case of the external object, there are infinitely many parts. So putting those two things together, they brought themselves to believe that somehow they have an idea of something with infinitely many parts. That is, they have this abstract idea that abstracts from what's true of all their actual ideas, namely that they have finitely many parts, just leaves that out. And they use that to represent something that has infinitely many parts, And then they can explain why the more parts you get, the closer this is to being true, because it's literally true of the real external triangles that have infinitely many parts. And the more parts you have, the better you're representing that. But according to Berkeley, all that is a mistake. It's not true, obviously, that there's an external triangle with infinitely many parts. And it's also not true that there's an abstract idea that doesn't have any particular number of parts. Rather, I'm always dealing with some particular idea. And I have rules for exchanging it with other ideas. So this is what I also said last time, saying that like geometrical figures, according to Berkeley, function pretty much just like words. And words and geometrical figures, he says, function like symbols in algebra. There's some particular symbol, but we have rules for exchanging it for a lot of other symbols under the right circumstances. And so we can, so to speak, operate with this one symbol. And as long as we follow the rules, we're allowed at the end to get out what we want, right? So like, although my idea has finitely many parts, I operate with it in such a way that it doesn't matter exactly how many they are. That's how I do the geometrical proof. And then at the end, I take the actual triangle I'm interested in, the way it looks to me from here, that has a certain number of finite parts, which is different from this triangle. But by an like exchange rule, I say, oh, and so it's true for that too. and um, and again, why does this work? Why does this syntax that I set up of exchanging one symbol for another and so on and so forth, why does it work? That is, why when I build something with, a side 3 here and a side 4 here, I can make sure that this is a right angle by making sure that this side has length exactly 5. Like, why does that work? Because God is regular. And again, I've by experience learned what things will work and what won't. Now, I mean, I'll say something else about this, which is that Berkeley says, and this will make mathematics much easier. Once we realize that you don't have to believe in these absurd things like the square root of 2 or whatever. So I think that shows a real lack of experience in mathematics, he says, right? I mean, it's similar to, I don't even know if this is true or if this is some kind of urban legend or whatever, that supposedly the legislature in some state once passed a law saying that pi from now on will equal 3 because they wanted to make, geometry simpler. But obviously, if you're required to say that pi equals 3, geometry will not get simpler. It will get much harder. And similarly, even worse in this case, where we say, no, this isn't exactly true. It depends on exactly which triangle you're talking about. That's going to make geometry into a nightmare. I mean, like whether that's a refutation, I guess, well, I mean, it's a sign that the mathematicians may be doing something else besides just believing in external triangles and abstract ideas, right? That is, I mean, they've introduced certain kinds of quantities because it's much simpler to talk about geometry if you talk about these quantities. And whether that's a reason to believe that those quantities actually exist, whatever that means, is I mean, that's a question that a lot of people have discussed in the time since Berkeley, and I don't think it's resolved. But anyway, I mean, there's something more going on here, I think, than Berkeley talks about. Okay, are there questions about that? As I said, we'll see that Hume's says something very similar, but in a way it's like almost the opposite. It's really weird. So find out what he says. Um, and now I have a little bit of time left to discuss what we usually call empirical science. I mean, if I'm right, Berkeley includes geometry and arithmetic under what we usually call under what he would call empirical science. Right? Arithmetic is also, it's based on our success in exchanging things for counters and counters for numerals and one system of numerals for another system of numerals. Um, uh, and I don't think Berkeley thinks we have any guarantee that that will work other than experience. But again, he doesn't say that explicitly, so I could be wrong. Okay, but certainly in the case of the study of nature, I guess I could, instead of empirical science, I could say natural science. In the study of nature, um, so he says, this is section 1 on page 34. No, section 31 on page 34. Right, the section begins, this gives us a sort of foresight which enables us to regulate our actions for the benefit of life. Right, this being the laws of nature. And then towards the end of the paragraph, he says, all this we know not by discovering any necessary connection between our ideas, but only by the observation of the settled laws of nature, without which we should be all in uncertainty and confusion, and a grown man no more know how to manage himself in the affairs of life than an infant just born. Right? So it's by my experience of certain ideas going together in certain patterns that I acquire any foresight as to what's going to happen. Um, and the way I acquire that foresight could be called like learning why things happen, learning the explanation of why things happen. I mean, you might think that's different from predicting what happens, but I think the way Berkeley understands explanation, it's pretty much the same thing. This is section 62 on page 47. Which explication consists only in showing the conformity any particular phenomenon has to the general laws of nature, or which is the same thing in discovering the uniformity there is in the production of natural effects. This is what's sometimes known as the covering law view of explanation. I mean, it wasn't known as that in Berkeley's time. I think that's a 20th century term. But it saying that to explain an individual, a particular event, is just to show that it's an instance of some universal law. So, so it's like explanation and prediction are the same thing, only prediction is before you've seen the effect and explanation is afterwards. In predict, you have this universal law. You know, like for all ideas, idea one implies idea two, or something like that. I guess I have to have two. Anyway, um, and you know, that's a bad way of writing it. Let me not. I either have to write it in much more detail or not write it that way. So I'm gonna not write it that way. But you have a universal law, such and such pattern of ideas is always followed by this. Um, you um, you see that pattern of ideas. Now you have a prediction. According to the universal law, it will be followed by this. If this happens, now I have an explanation why it happened, because it was an instance of the universal law. And that's all that Berkeley thinks science can do. I just left universal law floating here in the middle of the board, but you're supposed to imagine a particular event that's an instance of it. Right? So like the prediction means predicting that the particular event will be an instance of it, having seen the beginning of the particular event. Right? Explanation means verifying that it was an instance of it. And we stop there, right? As opposed to, well, number one, rationalists who think we can have an explanation in a much stronger sense. I mean, Berkeley says there is no such stronger sense. That's but they think there's a stronger sense in which they think we can have an explanation, right? Like we can know that if one body tries to move into the space occupied by another body, then either this one will stop or this one will have to move out of the way. Why? It's apparent from the very idea of body. We can use our reason. We don't need any experience. Um, um, Locke says we can know the same thing without any experience, but it's not by our reason, right? It's just by viewing that visible necessary connection. But Berkeley says, no, the only way we can know this is if we see it happen. And so he criticizes certain types of uses of universal laws. Basically, I guess, I mean, he criticizes taking the universal part too far. So he says, for example, the fashion nowadays is to trace everything to attraction, right? Because of Newton's law of universal gravitation. So Berkeley has in mind not only Newton's use of the law of gravitation, but also people saying, and similarly, why do the pieces of steel stick together? Because of the attraction between them. So Berkeley says, well, if by attraction you mean that certain bodies tend to move towards each other, then you may have observed that. And in a sense, it's an explanation of why these two particular bodies move together, but not in any stronger sense than just because this is what happened before. That is, there isn't some new thing I understand called abstraction that forces the bodies to do this. I don't know why they do it. Or rather, I do know why they do it. Namely, God wants them to do it, right? But that's all I know about it. So I don't know why they do it. In other words, I guess I would say Berkeley thinks a real explanation would be the kind of explanation the rationalists want, but he's saying we can never have that kind of explanation other than the general explanation that things happen because spirits make them happen. Right? So, and in particular, things happen in nature because God makes them happen. That is, God makes us have certain ideas of sense. That's what nature is. Um, right, so this is what he's trying to get across um, in section 103 on page 63. Um, the parts of steel we see cohere firmly together, and this also is accounted for by attraction. But in this, as in the other instances, I do not perceive that anything is signified besides the effect itself. Right? The saying that it happens because of abstraction is just saying, sorry, because of attraction. It's saying it just happens because, so to speak, because it's an instance of this universal law, which is universal as applied to pieces of steel, except when you blow them up, whatever, that the pieces move together. And so, like, you've explained that the pieces move together because they move together. um, um, For as to the manner of the action whereby it is produced, or the cause which produces it, these are not so much as aimed at, right? And again, according to Berkeley, they couldn't be aimed at by science because there's nothing to say about them except God wants it that way, right? The cause is always a spirit, and the spirits, we have no ideas that resemble them. Uh, I mean, so there's a misunderstanding of Newtonian mechanics here, which would require him to say things differently, but I don't think would undermine the argument. I mean, he doesn't understand, as I may have already said this in the case of Locke, I don't know. Um, Many philosophers, maybe even some now, but certainly like even as late as John Stuart Mill, and like they don't focus on the fact that in Newtonian physics, force explains acceleration, not motion. Right? So like when Berkeley talks about relative motion, he gets all confused about this because he, you know, he thinks that the impressed force is supposed to move the body, but the whole point of Newtonian mechanics is that a body in motion remains in motion. You don't need a force. um, so, all right, but anyway, I think I won't, given the limited amount of time that's left, I won't get into that. Um, um, so, and of course, he's also wrong about other things, right? Like, for example, that the fixed stars are not attracted to each other, right? He says the fixed stars obviously show no tendency to move towards each other. I think it was actually Kant who um, first proposed that the Milky Way is a sign that we live in a disc-shaped system of stars. um, It's like one of his little side things. um, anyway, right. So yeah, I mean, that's we definitely are falling towards the center of the galaxy, and if we weren't also moving, and we would go straight in if we weren't in orbit. But all right, never mind that. So and we're moving towards the great attractor, wherever that is. Um, all right, sorry. Um, so um, so I think that would play havoc with what Berkeley says about relativity of motion, but I don't think it would undermine what he's saying here about explanation. Um, so um, so basically, according to Berkeley, we have to regard natural laws as arbitrary principles. We don't see any reason for them. We can't see any reason for them. We do see a reason for there being natural laws. And given some natural laws, we can see a reason for others or for certain particular things to be set up a certain way. But that's all about final causes, right? That is, we see a reason for there to be natural laws, namely, if there were no natural laws, we wouldn't know what to do. Because we wouldn't know how to produce any of the effects that we want. That is, we wouldn't know what to do with our will in order to get the sensible ideas that we want. That is, the ones that are pleasurable, and not the ones that are painful, right? We would have no way of doing that if there weren't natural laws. So natural laws are good. And therefore, the fact that there are any natural laws is a sign that the divine will is good. And moreover, like given the natural laws we have, then, the way living things are set up, or the human body is set up, for example, or I guess more precisely, like what you'll see when you look at it more closely, or when you open it up and look inside and whatever, because those are different ideas than what you saw before. So anyway, like, we can understand that as being good because it's it's functional. But God could have made the laws of nature different, and then something different would have been functional. I don't think Berkeley claims that we can have some insight into why this was the best set of natural laws or something like that. Oops, and I'm out of time. So I'll just say, so therefore, Berkeley thinks there's no point in studying these natural laws. These are just arbitrary laws of grammar. There's no point in studying them any farther than we have a use for them. Other than that, what we should do is sit back and contemplate how good nature is. All right. That's it. Next time, Hume. And next time will be via Zoom once again. See you then.